What if the most terrifying fire in human memory was never meant to be remembered clearly? What if its echoes survived not in ruins alone, but in fragments of clay, half-erased words, and stories told as warnings rather than records? Somewhere between myth and memory, two cities vanish in heat so intense that even time seems to recoil. What remains is silence, and questions no one was meant to ask. Tonight, let us move slowly through that silence, listening, not to find answers, but to feel the weight of what was lost, and to follow the faint traces that still whisper beneath the surface of history. Long before the names Sodom and Gomorrah hardened into moral symbols, there was only a landscape, quiet, fertile, breathing beneath a sky that had not yet learned how to burn. The southern Levant was once a place of shallow waters and salt-rich plains, where rivers slowed and spread, where early settlements pressed themselves close to the margins of survival. The ground remembered floods, remembered droughts, remembered tremors. It also remembered fire, though no one would speak of it plainly. The oldest stories do not begin with destruction. They begin with absence, with gaps where continuity should have been. In the archaeological record of the Dead Sea Basin, layers appear where human occupation simply stops, not gradually, not as a slow decline, but abruptly, as if a sentence had been cut mid-breath. Above these layers, ash appears, melted minerals, shocked quartz, signs that heat once moved faster than human flight. Such traces are uncomfortable. They do not fit neatly into familiar narratives of slow cultural evolution. They suggest something sudden, overwhelming and indiscriminate, and when the ground refuses to explain itself fully, the mind turns elsewhere, to texts, to memory encoded as myth, to records not carved in stone but pressed into clay. Far to the east, beyond deserts and mountain chains, scribes in ancient Mesopotamia pressed reeds into wet tablets. They wrote of kings, of floods, of gods who descended in fire. These were not moral lessons in the modern sense, they were attempts to stabilize memory, to fix catastrophe into language before it slipped away. In some of these tablets, fire is not metaphorical. It is described as a force that scours cities, that leaves no shadow standing, that turns day into something brighter and more terrifying than night. These accounts do not name Sodom. They do not need to. Instead, they speak of divine radiance that overturns the plain, of winds that carry heat rather than relief, of survivors who wander into unfamiliar lands, carrying knowledge they cannot explain without sounding mad. The language is restrained, almost weary, as if the scribes themselves were careful not to awaken something dormant by naming it too directly. One tablet describes a storm of fire descending not like rain, but like judgment without voice. Another speaks of a city that was and then was not, reduced to a memory faster than morning could form. The descriptions are fragmentary, broken. As though even clay resisted holding the full shape of what occurred, geologists centuries later would begin to notice similar fractures in the earth itself. Salt formations warped unnaturally, sediment layers fused as if briefly liquefied, evidence of temperatures far exceeding those of ordinary fires or volcanic activity. Some would suggest meteor airbursts, others seismic releases igniting subterranean gases. Each explanation carries weight, and yet none feels complete on its own. What lingers uneasily is the convergence, texts and terrain echoing one another across millennia. Not as proof, but as resonance, the kind that settles into the body rather than the intellect. In the biblical tradition, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah becomes a moral tableau. Fire from heaven, cities judged, a pillar of salt standing as a warning. But the earlier layers of the story are quieter, less certain. They carry the texture of memory rather than doctrine, the sense that something real happened and that meaning was assigned afterward, like a bandage placed over a wound whose depth no one wished to examine too closely. The pillar of salt itself is telling. Salt is what remains when water leaves. It is preservation and desolation at once. In the Dead Sea region, salt pillars form naturally, shaped by erosion and time, but to imagine a human figure frozen into one is to suggest more than punishment. It suggests shock, stillness, the body caught between motion and annihilation. Ancient Near Eastern cultures were not strangers to catastrophe. Floods, fires, plagues, all were woven into their cosmologies. Yet some disasters were treated differently, spoken of obliquely, encased in ritual language, surrounded by taboos. Fire that fell from the sky belonged to this category. It was not simply destructive, it was destabilizing. It challenged the boundary between the natural and the divine. Sumerian texts often frame such events as resets, moments when the gods wipe the tablet clean. Civilization in this view is provisional, allowed but never guaranteed. When humans grow too numerous, too noisy, or too self-assured, the balance fractures. Fire becomes correction, not evil, not good, simply final. If such a reset occurred in the Levant, its memory may have travelled with refugees, traders, captives, carried west and south, reshaped with each retelling. By the time it reached later Hebrew authors, it had become a lesson, a warning etched into theology rather than geography. But beneath that lesson, the original fear still trembles, the fear of a sky that can betray, of heat that does not behave like fire should, of a moment so intense that it erases not just buildings, but confidence in the future. Modern science approaches these stories cautiously, skeptically. Yet even skepticism has begun to soften at the edges. Excavations at sites like Tall El Hammam reveal destruction layers dated to around the Middle Bronze Age, consistent with timelines long dismissed as symbolic. At these sites, pottery is vitrified. Bricks are melted on one side only, as if exposed to a directional blast. Human remains are scarce, suggesting not slow abandonment but instant obliteration. Still, no inscription reads, "Here was Sodom." And perhaps that absence is the point. Names anchor events, remove the name, and the event becomes harder to contain, more dangerous. It seeps into neighbouring cultures, changes shape, survives precisely because it is never pinned down. The Sumerian scribes may have understood this. Their restraint feels intentional. They wrote enough to remember, but not enough to invite repetition. Fire, once described too clearly, might return. As this part of the journey closes, the image that lingers is not of flames, but of silence after them, of a plain emptied not only of life, but of certainty. Somewhere between Mesopotamia and the Dead Sea, memory fractured. What survived did so in whispers, in clay impressions, in uneasy gaps that refused to stay buried. And if the first layer of this story is absence, then perhaps the next lies in asking why some memories are preserved as commandments, while others are allowed to dissolve into ash. Absence, once noticed, begins to draw the eye everywhere. It hides not only in the ground, but in language itself. Certain words appear often in ancient records, then suddenly thin out, as if the scribes themselves hesitated. In Sumerian and Akkadian texts, fire is usually practical, kilns, hearths, offerings. But there is another fire described differently. It arrives without fuel, it leaves no time for prayer, it does not linger, and after it passes the writers grow cautious. Some tablets speak of a brilliance that flattened the land. Others describe heat that moved like wind, stripping walls of their skins and turning fields into lifeless crusts. These are not poetic flourishes. They are oddly technical, almost observational, as if the scribes were recording something they did not fully understand but did not dare embellish either. The tone is restrained, measured, the kind of writing that suggests trauma remembered rather than myth invented. What is striking is not only what is said, but what is omitted. The gods responsible are unnamed, or named obliquely. There is no extended justification, no list of sins, only consequence. It is as though moral framing came later, layered atop an older, more frightening memory, that destruction can arrive without explanation. In Mesopotamian cosmology, floods are intelligible. They come from excess, from imbalance in water and weather. Fire from the sky is different. It implies intrusion, an event that does not belong to the normal cycles of the world, something external, or at least something that violates expectation. And when expectation breaks, meaning becomes unstable. This instability may explain why later cultures struggled to integrate such an event cleanly into their narratives. In Hebrew scripture, The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is framed as judgment, but the mechanism itself remains vague. Fire and brimstone fall, yet the source is distant, almost abstract. The story moves quickly, as if reluctant to dwell on the physics of what occurred. The emphasis shifts instead to behavior, obedience, escape. Yet the physical details refuse to disappear entirely. The land becomes inhospitable. Water turns bitter. Vegetation fails to return. These are environmental aftershocks, not moral ones. They suggest a long-term alteration of the landscape, consistent with extreme heat and chemical disruption. The Dead Sea, with its lifeless density, becomes a standing reminder that something here went wrong, in a way time has not fully repaired. Modern researchers have proposed explanations that attempt to bridge text and terrain. A meteor airburst, similar to the Tunguska event, could produce immense heat without leaving a crater. Such an explosion would generate shockwaves capable of flattening structures and igniting materials over a wide area. It would also explain the directional melting observed at some sites. Fire, in this case, would not fall, it would arrive sideways, expanding faster than sound. Others point to tectonic instability. The Dead Sea Rift is one of the most active fault systems in the region. Earthquakes could release pockets of flammable gases, creating sudden infernos. But earthquakes are familiar to ancient peoples. They leave survivors. They leave stories of shaking and collapse. What is described in the older texts feels different, cleaner, more absolute. There is also the question of timing. Destruction layers at several sites across the southern Levant appear within a narrow window, not centuries apart but clustered. This suggests a regional event rather than isolated accidents. The land, for a moment, seems to have been treated as a single surface, exposed to a single overwhelming force. If such an event occurred, its survivors would have faced an impossible task. How does one describe a fire that does not behave like fire? How does one warn future generations without inciting panic or disbelief? Myth becomes a solution, not because it is fanciful, but because it is flexible. It allows memory to survive without demanding precision. Over time, the language shifts. Fire becomes the will of gods. Heat becomes punishment. The randomness of catastrophe is softened by the idea of order, even if that order is terrifying. A city destroyed because it was wicked is easier to accept than a city destroyed because it stood in the wrong place at the wrong time. But beneath the moral surface, the older fear remains embedded. It surfaces in small details, the insistence that no one look back. The transformation of a human body into salt. The emphasis on immediacy. These are the fingerprints of shock, not sermon. Sumerian records, in contrast, do not moralize in the same way. They document cycles. They speak of eras before and after, of kingship lowered from heaven, then withdrawn. Civilization in this view is not a straight line, but a series of fragile experiments. Fire is not punishment, it is erasure, and erasure does not argue its case. There is a subtle but important difference here. In one tradition, catastrophe teaches. In the other, it interrupts. Teaching implies continuity. Interruption implies reset. If the Sumerian perspective preserves anything, it is the unsettling idea that knowledge itself can be lost in an instant. That writing, cities, even memory can vanish, leaving later cultures to reconstruct meaning from fragments. This reconstruction is never neutral. Each generation shapes the past to fit its anxieties. A people concerned with law and covenant will remember fire as judgment. A people concerned with cosmic balance will remember it as correction. But the original event, whatever it was, remains just out of reach, like a shape seen through smoke. As this layer of the story settles, the question shifts quietly, not toward who was guilty or which god acted, but toward what kind of world allows such events to occur at all. A world where the sky can become hostile, where progress offers no shield, where the boundary between the ordinary and the annihilating is thinner than comfort allows. And if memory reshapes disaster to make it bearable, what happens to the parts that cannot be reshaped? Do they sink into silence, waiting for a moment when the ground itself begins to speak again? When catastrophe cannot be explained, it often becomes managed. Not immediately, but gradually, as memory cools and survivors seek patterns that make endurance possible. In the ancient world, this management took many forms: ritual, law, genealogy, and perhaps most quietly of all, it took the form of silence arranged into structure. In Mesopotamia, scribes were not merely record keepers, they were custodians of continuity. Their work was to ensure that kings followed kings, that floods followed warnings, that the gods remained legible. Yet in some sequences of tablets, continuity breaks. Lists of rulers pause, chronologies restart. Entire generations seem to dissolve between lines. These are not accidents of preservation alone. They suggest moments when order itself faltered and had to be reassembled afterward. Such reassembly requires choices. What is remembered? What is softened? What is never written again? One pattern repeats with unsettling consistency. After descriptions of overwhelming destruction, whether by flood or fire, texts often shift toward reorganization. New laws appear, new measures of land, new calendars, as if the world, having been burned clean, demanded a different framework to prevent recurrence, or at least to give the illusion of control. In this light, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah begins to resemble not a single moral episode, but the residue of a broader cultural reflex, a way of responding to trauma by narrowing its meaning, by localizing it. 2 cities, not a region, a handful of transgressions, not an incomprehensible force. The story becomes smaller, safer, easier to pass down without reopening the original wound. Yet the narrowing is imperfect. The geography resists it. The Dead Sea Basin remains anomalous. Geologically volatile, chemically hostile, visually stark, it is a scar that refuses to fade. Travellers throughout history have remarked on its stillness, its silence, its refusal to support life. These observations are often framed as curiosity or punishment, but they also read like unease, a sense that this place remembers something people do not. Ancient maps are revealing here. Early cartographic traditions tend to distort or marginalize the region. It becomes a boundary, a margin, a place passed by rather than entered. Even trade routes bend away. Avoidance, when repeated over centuries, begins to resemble memory encoded as behavior rather than story. In Sumerian thought, places of great destruction were sometimes marked as closed, not forbidden in a legal sense, but sealed conceptually. Areas where the normal relationship between humans and the divine had broken down. To enter such a place without ritual preparation was dangerous, not because of lingering gods, but because the balance had not been restored. This idea of imbalance is crucial. Fire that erases cities does more than destroy structures. It disrupts trust. Trust in the sky, trust in seasons, trust in the assumption that tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough to plan for. When that trust breaks, societies become cautious, conservative, inclined to preserve rather than innovate. And yet innovation returns. It always does. Cities rise again, sometimes directly atop older ruins. This layering is often described as resilience, but it may also be compulsion, a refusal to accept that some places carry histories too volatile to inhabit safely. Each rebuild becomes an act of defiance against memory or perhaps against fear. In the biblical narrative, the survivors do not rebuild. They flee. They move into the hills. The cities are left empty. This detail is often overlooked, but it is significant. It suggests that the destruction was perceived as final, not temporary, that whatever force acted there was not expected to remain dormant. Lot's wife, in this context, becomes less a moral figure than a psychological one. Turning back is not disobedience, it is human reflex, the desire to witness what has happened, to confirm it, to anchor the unreal in sight. Her transformation into salt freezes that reflex mid-motion. Curiosity becomes fatal, memory itself becomes dangerous. Salt, again, is not incidental. It preserves, but it also sterilizes. A salted field cannot support crops. A salted body cannot decay normally. The image suggests a kind of arrested aftermath. Nothing grows. Nothing moves on. The moment remains suspended. Some scholars have noted parallels between this image and older Mesopotamian motifs, where witnesses to divine catastrophe are sometimes altered, blinded, silenced, transformed, not as punishment, but as containment. To see too much is to risk destabilizing the present. If this is so, then the management of memory is not only cultural but biological. Trauma reshapes perception. It alters what can be spoken without harm. Entire communities may inherit these limits unconsciously, passing them down as custom rather than confession. This inheritance complicates modern attempts to reconstruct the past. Archaeology seeks patterns. Textual analysis seeks origins. But both encounter zones of resistance, places where data thins and interpretation becomes tentative. These zones are often dismissed as gaps, but gaps themselves carry information. They tell us where certainty failed. In the Dead Sea region, the gaps are unusually dense. Occupation halts. Writing shifts tone. Myths harden. The land becomes a warning without a clear message, and so later traditions fill in the silence with meaning that suits their needs. Yet something remains unresolved. If the destruction was merely local, why does its echo appear so widely? Why do distant cultures retain images of fire from the sky, of cities erased, of divine withdrawal followed by reordering? Convergence does not prove causation, but it unsettles coincidence. Perhaps the fire remembered in Sumer and the fire remembered in the Levant were not the same event, but expressions of the same vulnerability. A recognition that human settlements exist beneath forces they cannot negotiate with. That sometimes the world resets without asking permission. As this part of the journey settles into quiet, the sense that emerges is not one of clarity, but of containment, of stories shaped to hold something too large to face directly. And if containment was necessary once, it raises a quieter concern now. What happens when the structures built to manage memory begin to erode, and the old silences start to speak again? When silence persists long enough, it begins to shape belief, not as doctrine, but as instinct. Civilizations that inherit unspoken catastrophes often develop sensitivities they cannot explain, rituals that feel excessive, taboos whose origins are forgotten, fears that surface only at the edges of language. These are not superstitions in the simple sense, they are memory adapted for survival. In the land surrounding the Dead Sea, certain patterns recur with quiet insistence. Settlements shift uphill. Architecture becomes lighter, more temporary. Wells are dug cautiously, sealed carefully, as if the ground itself might exhale danger. These changes are rarely attributed to a single cause in the record. They appear instead as adjustments, small and rational on their own, but together suggesting an environment no longer fully trusted. Fire leaves more than ash. It alters imagination. A people who have seen the sky ignite do not look upward the same way again. The heavens cease to be merely distant. They become intimate, capable of intrusion. This intimacy is unsettling. It demands explanation, or at least narrative control. Over generations, narrative control often takes the form of law, rules about hospitality, about movement, about obedience during moments of crisis. In the Sodom story, guests arrive unexpectedly. They are protected at all costs. The city fails this test and is destroyed. Reader's morality, the lesson is social. Reader's memory, it is procedural. When strangers arrive before catastrophe, they may not be strangers at all. They may be warnings. In ancient societies, messengers and disasters were frequently linked. A flood is preceded by signs, a plague by dreams, a fire by visitors who must not be ignored. This pattern does not imply literal angels, but heightened attention to anomalies. When the world has betrayed you once, you learn to watch for deviations. The insistence that Lot's family leave without delay reflects this vigilance. No time to gather possessions, no debate, no retrospection. Survival depends on motion, not understanding. This is not the logic of theology. It is the logic of emergency, preserved and ritualized. Elsewhere in the ancient Near East, similar logics appear. Myths describe cities warned too late, kings who hesitate, populations who doubt until the moment of erasure. These stories do not condemn doubt in abstract terms, they condemn delay. The hesitation to act when patterns no longer align with expectation. Delay is dangerous because it assumes continuity. It assumes that tomorrow will function like today. Catastrophic fire destroys this assumption. It introduces the idea that the present can end without transition. This idea is difficult to carry across centuries. It threatens stability. so it becomes encoded indirectly, in symbols rather than statements, pillars of salt, burning rain, angels who do not explain themselves. These images compress fear into manageable forms, allowing it to be passed on without overwhelming the listener. Yet even compression has limits. Over time, the original texture of the fear smooths out. Sharp edges soften into allegory. The land remains hostile, but the reason becomes moral rather than physical. Sin replaces shock. Judgment replaces randomness. Meaning replaces terror. This replacement is comforting, but incomplete, because the ground still tells a different story. Salt flats do not care about morality. Melted stone does not testify to ethics. It testifies to temperature, to force, to duration. When modern excavation peels back these layers, discomfort returns, not because ancient texts are disproven, but because they are complicated. The moral story may sit atop a physical one, not in opposition to it. Judgment may be the language chosen to speak about something that resisted all other description. In this sense, the biblical and Sumerian traditions may not be arguing with each other at all. They may be approaching the same wound from different angles. One frames it as breach of order, the other as withdrawal of favour. Both agree on one point. The world can change suddenly, and when it does, human frameworks fracture. This fracture may explain another recurring motif, the fear of looking back. To look back is to seek continuity, to confirm that what was still is. But in a reset event, continuity is precisely what has been broken. Looking back risks confusion, paralysis, or worse, attachment to a world that no longer exists. Psychologically, this makes sense. Survivors of extreme events often report difficulty revisiting the moment of rupture. Memory becomes disjointed, sensory fragments intrude without context. Language fails. The mind protects itself by moving forward, sometimes at the cost of coherence. If ancient societies experienced something analogous on a collective scale, their myths would reflect that coping strategy. Move forward, rebuild elsewhere, rename the past as lesson rather than event, allow the details to blur, and yet details persist stubbornly. Fire that arrives without smoke, heat that kills instantly, a region rendered uninhabitable for generations. These are not easy to allegorize completely. They resist full assimilation into moral narrative. The Dead Sea itself becomes a kind of archive, not a library, but a reservoir of reminders. Its density prevents drowning, forcing bodies to float unnaturally. Its shores preserve objects in salt, delaying decay. It is a place where the usual processes of erasure slow down, where traces linger longer than expected. Perhaps this is why the region attracts so much speculation, not because it promises answers, but because it refuses closure. Every attempt to explain it fully leaves residue. Every story told about it casts a shadow that does not quite align. As this part of the journey settles, the sense that emerges is of a memory held in tension, neither forgotten nor understood. A fire remembered not as flame, but as behavioral change, as laws, taboos, and stories shaped around an absence. And if civilizations carry such absences within them, shaping their fears and structures in ways they no longer recognize, it raises a quiet possibility that some of what we call culture is not built on knowledge at all, but on avoidance. Avoidance, once embedded, begins to masquerade as tradition. What starts as a protective instinct hardens into structure, then into certainty. Over centuries, people forget what they were protecting themselves from, but they continue the behaviors all the same. This is how civilizations carry ghosts without naming them. In the ancient Near East, fire becomes increasingly ceremonial as time passes. Controlled, contained, ritualized. Altars replace open flames. Offerings are carefully measured. Fire is no longer allowed to roam freely across the imagination. It must be summoned, supervised, extinguished with care. This shift is subtle, but telling. A force once feared for its autonomy is now framed as something that obeys rules. Yet beneath this order, anxiety lingers. Many ritual texts include elaborate precautions, purification steps, precise timings, prohibitions against error. A mistake is not merely incorrect, it is dangerous. Fire, if mishandled, does not forgive. Does not. The language around it carries tension, as though the writers are aware that what they are controlling is only a smaller, safer echo of something once uncontrollable. This tension appears again in stories of divine presence. When gods descend, they do so in fire, cloud, or blinding light. Their arrival is overwhelming, disorienting. Humans are instructed to keep distance. Boundaries are drawn. The encounter is possible but limited. To approach too closely is to risk annihilation. Such stories are often read as expressions of reverence. They may also be read as inherited caution. An encoded memory of proximity gone wrong, of a moment when the boundary between human settlement and cosmic force collapsed, with irreversible consequences. The Sumerian idea of divine withdrawal after catastrophe is especially revealing. In some texts, the gods retreat following acts of destruction, leaving humanity to rebuild alone. This withdrawal is not framed as abandonment, but as necessity. The presence of such power is too destabilizing to remain near indefinitely. This mirrors a psychological pattern seen after trauma. Survivors often describe a sense of distance, from others, from meaning, from the world as it once was. The withdrawal is not chosen. It happens because closeness feels unsafe, too intense, too unpredictable. If early civilizations experienced an event of overwhelming heat and destruction, their myths of distant gods may reflect this shift, a move from intimacy to separation, from shared space to regulated contact. Heaven moves farther away, not because humans fall, but because proximity has proven lethal. Over time, this distance becomes normalized. Gods belong in the sky, humans remain below. The idea that the sky itself could intervene violently becomes less thinkable, more symbolic. Fire from above is transformed into metaphor, prophecy, or end-time speculation. Something that happened once or will happen later, but not now. This temporal displacement is important. It pushes catastrophe out of the present, allowing daily life to proceed. The fire becomes past or future, never immediate. In doing so, societies protect themselves from constant vigilance, which would otherwise paralyze action. But displacement has a cost. It dulls sensitivity to warning signs. When danger is always elsewhere in time, the present feels deceptively stable. The sky becomes scenery again. Weather becomes background. Anomalies are dismissed. Archaeological layers tell a different story. They show cycles of confidence and interruption, periods of dense settlement followed by sudden emptiness. Not all of these interruptions are violent, but some are unmistakably abrupt. The rhythm suggests not a single forgotten catastrophe, but a pattern of forgetting itself. Each generation inherits structures built by the previous one: walls, laws, myths. These structures assume continuity. They are designed for a world that behaves. When the world does not, the structures fail quickly. Their failure is often total. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, the failure is preserved as spectacle. Fire rains down, cities vanish, the survivors escape with nothing. The story is stark because it compresses collapse into a single image. But collapse itself is rarely so clean. It unfolds across systems: food, trust, meaning. The biblical account simplifies this complexity, perhaps intentionally. By attributing destruction to moral cause, it restores a sense of order. Behavior leads to outcome. Obedience leads to survival. Disobedience leads to death. This clarity is soothing, especially when the alternative is randomness. Yet the Sumerian echoes resist this clarity. They speak of destruction without instruction, of loss without lesson, of eras ending because they end. This perspective is more unsettling, but also more honest to the experience of catastrophe as it is lived. When these two traditions intersect, friction emerges. Moral certainty rubs against existential unease. The result is a story that oscillates, confident in its judgment, but haunted by its details, haunted by the speed of the fire, by the totality of the loss. Modern readers often side with one interpretation or the other. Either the story is symbolic or it is historical, either moral or physical. But the ancient mind did not divide the world this way. Meaning and matter were intertwined. A fire that destroys cities also destroys assumptions. It forces re-evaluation on every level. Perhaps this is why the story continues to resonate, not because it offers answers, but because it preserves tension, a sense that beneath our explanations something remains unresolved. As civilizations advanced, they became better at recording, categorizing, predicting. But no system fully eliminates vulnerability. The sky remains vast, the earth remains active, heat remains indifferent. The deeper question is not whether Sodom and Gomorrah existed exactly as described, or whether Sumerian tablets refer to the same event. The deeper question is how much of human culture is shaped by encounters with forces that exceed comprehension, and how much of what we call morality is an attempt to negotiate with those forces after the fact. As this part of the journey settles into quiet, what lingers is the image of fire no longer visible, but still shaping behaviour. A past event transformed into distance, ritual, and restraint. And if avoidance can become tradition, then tradition itself may sometimes be a map of dangers we no longer remember how to name. Tradition, once established, begins to speak with the voice of inevitability. What began as a response hardens into a rule. What was once a memory becomes a mandate. In that slow transformation, the originating event retreats further into shadow, leaving behind structures that feel ancient, authoritative, and strangely detached from their source. After periods of overwhelming disruption, societies tend to reorganize around permanence. Materials change, stone replaces mud brick, laws multiply, genealogies lengthen. The future is protected not through adaptability, but through repetition. This instinct is understandable. When the world has demonstrated its capacity for sudden erasure, stability becomes sacred. Yet permanence is a fragile illusion. Stone endures, but it also conceals weakness. The higher the walls, the more confidence placed in them, and confidence, when untested, quietly invites neglect. In the memory of Sodom and Gomorrah, permanence is conspicuously absent. The cities vanish entirely. No rebuilding follows, no promise of restoration appears later in the narrative. This finality is unusual. In most ancient accounts, destruction is temporary. Cities fall, then rise again under new names. Here, absence itself becomes the monument. That absence may serve a purpose. A city rebuilt too quickly allows forgetting. An empty plain forces remembrance, even if that remembrance is uneasy and incomplete. Over time, the land itself becomes the archive. Those who pass through the Dead Sea basin often describe sensations that are difficult to articulate. The air feels heavier, sound behaves oddly, distances seem compressed. These impressions are subjective, yet remarkably consistent across eras. They suggest an environment that resists familiarity, that refuses to become background. Ancient people relied heavily on such perceptions. Before instruments, the body was the measuring device. Discomfort carried meaning. A place that felt wrong was treated with caution, avoided, or surrounded by ritual. This was not superstition, but embodied knowledge shaped by survival. In this light, the designation of certain lands as cursed or forbidden may reflect accumulated experience rather than theological invention. A region where crops fail, water sickens, and settlement does not recover would quickly earn a reputation. Over generations, that reputation would solidify into story. The story, in turn, accomplishes what experience alone cannot. It transmits caution across time. In Sumerian texts, lands affected by catastrophic events are sometimes described as silent. Silence here is not peace. It is the absence of human rhythm. No markets, no songs, no domestic noise. Silence as outcome rather than intention. These lands are not evil. They are simply incompatible with ordinary life. Later traditions often reinterpret this incompatibility as punishment. The logic is comforting. A punished land explains why it should be avoided. A damaged land demands explanation. Avoidance preserves life. Explanation invites risk. This tension recurs throughout human history. Places of destruction repel settlement while attracting curiosity. Volcanoes, fault lines, and impact sites all draw observers who feel compelled to look closer, even when danger is evident. The same impulse may have operated around the ruins associated with Sodom and Gomorrah. The land warned people away, but imagination kept pulling them back. Imagination, however, reshapes what it touches. Over time, curiosity becomes abstraction. Physical details blur. Moral frameworks sharpen. The cities become symbols rather than locations. Their destruction becomes timeless rather than situated. This abstraction allows the story to travel. It becomes portable, adaptable to new anxieties. Fire from the sky transforms into a rhetorical instrument, invoked whenever societies feel threatened by excess, disorder, or decline. The catastrophe becomes an idea, no longer a memory. But portability comes at a cost. It strips the event of specificity. It severs the connection between narrative and environment. The destruction feels less real, easier to dismiss as allegory. The earth resists this dismissal. Salt formations remain. Ash layers persist. Melted stone records temperature, not morality. These materials testify to force and duration, not ethics. Modern inquiry approaches such evidence cautiously. Claims of ancient high-energy events provoke resistance. They challenge assumptions about gradual change and predictable risk. To accept them is to accept that history includes moments of radical discontinuity. Discontinuity unsettles narratives of progress. It suggests that advancement is fragile, that knowledge can vanish, that complexity does not guarantee resilience. Ancient cultures may have understood this more intuitively. Their myths allow for resets. They assume cycles of rise and errata. Civilization is not guaranteed. It is provisional. In Sumerian king lists, rulership is said to descend from heaven and later be withdrawn. Authority in this view is conditional. It exists at the discretion of forces beyond human control. Cities flourish only while permission holds. Fire that erases cities fits easily into this worldview. It is not an aberration, but enforcement. A reminder that human systems operate beneath constraints they cannot negotiate with. The biblical tradition emphasizes covenant instead, a relationship promising continuity if conditions are met. Sodom and Gomorrah appear as exceptions, examples of covenant broken. Yet even here, the narrative hesitates. Negotiation occurs. Numbers are discussed. Mercy is considered. The destruction is not immediate. This delay suggests discomfort, as though the tradition itself struggles to reconcile total erasure with moral order. That struggle may preserve an older memory beneath the moral frame, a memory of fire that did not wait for judgment, negotiation, or explanation. A fire that arrived because conditions aligned, not because sins were tallied. As this part of the journey settles, attention shifts from what was destroyed to what endured. Habits, fears, avoidances, structures built around an absence. Civilizations often define themselves by what they remember. But survival may depend just as much on what they choose to forget, carefully, deliberately, and never completely. And if forgetting can function as protection, then remembering when it resurfaces may carry a danger of its own. When a memory threatens stability, it rarely disappears. Instead, it changes shape. It sinks below language and resurfaces as habit, as rhythm, as an unspoken sense of caution that no one remembers learning. This is how civilizations carry knowledge they cannot afford to confront directly. In many ancient cultures, danger was not always named. It was scheduled. Certain seasons were treated differently. Certain nights were observed in silence. Fires were lit or extinguished according to patterns that seemed arbitrary to later observers, but felt necessary to those who inherited them. These patterns did not explain themselves. They did not need to. They worked. Calendars, in this sense, were not neutral tools. They were memory devices. They encoded anxiety into time, a reminder that the world was not uniformly safe, that some moments carried greater risk than others. This was especially true in societies that watched the sky closely, not for beauty, but for deviation. Long before formal astronomy, people learned to recognize regularity. Stars that returned, seasons that cycled. Against this backdrop of predictability, anything that broke pattern became significant. Sudden lights, trails across the darkness, a night brighter than it should be. These events were rare, but their rarity made them memorable. In Mesopotamian omen texts, celestial irregularities are catalogued with painstaking care. The language is cautious, observational. It avoids certainty. A star flares unexpectedly, and the tablet notes what followed: unrest, famine, destruction. The relationship is not always causal, but it is never ignored. Fire from the sky occupies a unique position in this system. It is not continuous like rain. It is not cyclical like flood. It is episodic, sudden, transformative. Its arrival collapses time, turning anticipation into aftermath in a single moment. If such an event once devastated a populated region, it would have left more than physical scars. It would have recalibrated attention. The sky would no longer be background. It would become an actor capable of intervention. This recalibration may explain why some traditions preserve a heightened alertness to signs, while others move quickly to moral interpretation. Watching the sky requires patience and uncertainty. Moral framing offers clarity. One demands vigilance, the other demands obedience. The biblical account of Sodom and Gomorrah leans toward obedience. The warning is specific, delivered privately. There is no public sign, no chance for collective response. The destruction is framed as sudden and total, emphasizing the futility of resistance once the moment arrives. Yet the suddenness itself feels observational rather than symbolic. The cities are destroyed before anyone can react. There is no siege, no gradual escalation. Night becomes unbearable brightness. Heat precedes sound. These details feel less like allegory and more like memory compressed into narrative. In later centuries, eyewitness accounts of meteor airbursts describe similar sequences. A flash brighter than the sun, a wave of heat that ignites surfaces, confusion so intense that people cannot tell which direction is safe. The body reacts before the mind understands. If ancient witnesses experienced something comparable, their descendants would inherit the aftermath without the event itself. Ruined land, abandoned settlements, stories too frightening to repeat in full. Over time, the event would recede, leaving only its behavioral consequences. One such consequence is dispersion. After catastrophic loss, populations tend to spread out. Large, dense cities feel dangerous. Smaller communities feel safer. This pattern appears repeatedly after major disruptions. It is not ideological. It is instinctive. In the Levant, periods following destruction layers often show reduced urban density. Settlements fragment. Trade routes shift. It is as though people unconsciously recalibrate risk, even if they cannot articulate why. Over generations, this recalibration becomes normal. Cities grow again. Confidence returns. The sky fades back into scenery. But the old patterns remain embedded, dormant, ready to resurface when conditions align. This dormancy is important. It allows societies to function without constant fear. Yet it also creates vulnerability. When memory is buried too deeply, warning signs may go unrecognized. What was once known as dangerous becomes merely unusual. The Sumerian worldview seems to accept this cycle. Knowledge is lost, relearned, lost again. Civilization is an oscillation, not a trajectory. Fire, flood, and famine are not failures of morality, but expressions of scale. Humanity operates within a system that does not center human intention. The biblical worldview pushes against this acceptance. It insists that meaning governs outcome, that behavior matters, that catastrophe communicates something. This insistence preserves agency, but it also narrows interpretation. Perhaps both approaches are incomplete on their own. Observation without meaning breeds anxiety. Meaning without observation breeds complacency. The ancient texts preserve fragments of both, even when they appear to contradict each other. In the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the sky is strangely silent. No stars are mentioned, no signs recorded, yet the destruction feels cosmological in scale. This silence may itself be a clue, a sign that the original observational context was already fading when the story was written down. What remained was urgency, fear, and the sense that once the moment arrives, explanation is irrelevant. Survival depends on motion, not comprehension. This emphasis on immediacy may be the most faithful inheritance of the original event. Whatever caused the fire, it did not allow deliberation. It did not announce itself publicly. It arrived, transformed the landscape, and withdrew, leaving humans to argue over meaning afterward. As modern societies accumulate data and predictive tools, it is tempting to believe that such moments belong to the past, that we would see them coming, that nothing so sudden could surprise us now. And yet, uncertainty persists. Objects go undetected. Systems fail. Rare events remain rare precisely because they defy expectation. Ancient stories endure not because they explain the world, but because they remind us of its capacity to exceed explanation. They whisper that beneath our structures, calendars, and assurances, there remains an element of exposure. As this part of the journey settles into quiet, the sense that lingers is not fear, but attentiveness, a subtle shift of awareness upward and outward, toward the recognition that some knowledge survives best when it does not speak loudly. And if memory has learned to disguise itself to endure, then perhaps the most important truths are not those declared openly, but those that continue to shape behavior long after their origin has been forgotten. As memory disguises itself, it does not vanish, it migrates. It moves from observation into structure, from structure into instinct, from instinct into silence. Over long spans of time, this migration reshapes not only stories, but landscapes of belief. What remains visible is rarely the origin. What remains powerful is the pressure it exerts. In the centuries after great destruction, societies often develop a deep attachment to boundaries. Not only walls and borders, but conceptual limits between sacred and profane, safe and unsafe, permitted and forbidden. These limits are not arbitrary. They are defensive geometry, drawn to keep chaos from leaking back in. In the region associated with Sodom and Gomorrah, boundaries multiply. The land becomes segmented, usable ground here, dead ground there, water drinkable in one place, poisonous in another. The terrain itself teaches discrimination. Step too far, dig too deep, linger too long, and the environment responds harshly. Ancient people did not require theory to understand this. They learned through repetition, through loss, through the quiet transmission of caution from one generation to the next. This is how certain regions acquire reputations that outlive explanation. Over time, these reputations become symbolic. A valley stands not just for a place, but for a category of danger, a reminder embedded in geography. When stories speak of destruction by fire, listeners do not imagine any city. They imagine that place. The land itself becomes a mnemonic device. Yet mnemonics fade when removed from context. As populations shift, as languages change, as empires rise and fall, the original environmental knowledge weakens. What was once practical caution becomes moral metaphor. The land remains, but its meaning transforms. This transformation can be seen in how later texts handle detail. Early accounts are sparse, hesitant, almost reluctant. Later retellings grow more confident, more polished. The roughness of lived experience smooths into narrative clarity. Ambiguity resolves into lesson, but clarity is not the same as accuracy. It is simply easier to transmit. The biblical tradition, shaped by centuries of reinterpretation, preserves the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah as a moment of absolute judgment. The emphasis is on transgression, on violation of order. The fire becomes a response. The cause is named, even if the mechanism remains vague. What recedes is the environmental specificity, the land's volatility, the region's instability, the possibility that the cities were not uniquely wicked, but uniquely vulnerable, that they stood at the intersection of forces indifferent to moral distinction. This receding does not negate the story's power, it redirects it. The story becomes ethical rather than geological, portable rather than situated. It can be told anywhere, applied everywhere. Yet something is lost in this portability, the sense that catastrophe has geography, that not all places are equal, that some locations carry risks invisible until activated. Modern disaster studies return in a way to this older sensitivity. They map fault lines, floodplains, impact probabilities. They recognize that where something happens matters as much as what happens. But this recognition is recent, and it exists alongside centuries of abstraction. Ancient cultures may have held both understandings simultaneously. They lacked instruments, but they possessed attentiveness. They may not have known why certain places failed repeatedly, but they noticed that they did. In Sumerian thought, the land itself could become angry or closed, not emotionally but functionally, a place no longer receptive to human order. Attempts to impose structure there would collapse. Crops would fail. Buildings would not last. This idea appears again and again in myths of cursed ground, barren valleys, forbidden zones. Such places are rarely redeemed. They are avoided, respected, sometimes ritualized, but rarely reclaimed. The biblical narrative reflects this avoidance. After the destruction, the plain is left behind. Life moves upward, away from the valley. The geography of survival shifts. Higher ground feels safer even if it is less fertile. Security replaces abundance as the priority. This shift echoes patterns seen after many large-scale disasters. People trade efficiency for safety, density for dispersion. The instinct is not ideological. It is embodied memory responding to threat. Over generations, as threat perception fades, density returns. Cities grow again. The old instincts loosen. Boundaries soften. Confidence rebuilds. And with it, vulnerability quietly re-enters. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah may persist because it interrupts this cycle. It reintroduces rupture into continuity. It insists that erasure is possible, that not all decline is gradual, that some endings arrive without negotiation. This insistence is uncomfortable. It resists assimilation into progress narratives. It suggests that human systems, no matter how refined, remain contingent. In the Sumerian worldview, contingency is assumed. The gods are not bound to human schedules. Favor is granted, then withdrawn. Eras end, new ones begin. There is no promise that the next age will resemble the last. The biblical worldview struggles with this impermanence. It seeks covenant, continuity, assurance. When catastrophe breaks through, it must be explained in moral terms to preserve coherence. Both approaches serve a purpose. One prepares for disruption, the other preserves meaning. Between them lies tension that has never fully resolved. Perhaps that tension is itself the inheritance of an event too large to be contained by a single interpretation. A fire that altered land, behavior, and belief simultaneously. As this part of the journey settles, attention drifts back to the ground. To salt-crusted soil, to abandoned spaces, to places where nothing grows, not because nothing has been planted, but because conditions refuse cooperation. Such places remind us that history is not only written by people, it is also written by environments, by heat, by shock, by forces that leave marks long after stories have changed. And if landscapes can remember what cultures reshape, then the earth itself may be holding a version of the past that no narrative can fully translate, waiting patiently, indifferent to whether it is believed. When the land refuses to cooperate, interpretation begins to fracture. People search for reasons that fit their frameworks, even when the ground itself offers none. Over time, explanation replaces observation, and the landscape becomes a canvas for meaning rather than evidence. Yet the evidence remains, quietly resisting translation. In the centuries following Great Destruction, societies often turn inward. Attention shifts from environment to behavior, from external forces to internal order. Laws grow more detailed, codes become stricter. The assumption takes hold that if life can be controlled precisely enough, catastrophe can be kept at bay. This shift is understandable. Forces that cannot be negotiated with are terrifying. Rules, by contrast, feel manageable. They imply causality. They promise that outcomes can be shaped through compliance. In this way, law becomes a kind of shelter against randomness. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah sits at the center of this transformation. Its later interpretations emphasize social violation, excess, and refusal of hospitality. The cities are destroyed not because of where they stand, but because of how their people behave. The fire becomes a response, not an intrusion. Yet the ground beneath the story does not confirm this neatness. Environmental collapse does not follow moral logic. Salt does not accumulate selectively. Heat does not discriminate between virtuous and corrupt stone. The physical aftermath described, barren land, poisoned water, lasting abandonment, suggests a force indifferent to human categories. This indifference may explain why earlier layers of the tradition feel uneasy. The narrative rushes past the event. It avoids sensory detail. It does not linger on suffering. The destruction is asserted, not described, as if description itself might destabilize the moral frame. Elsewhere in the ancient world, similar patterns appear. Catastrophes are acknowledged, then quickly reinterpreted. Floods become cleansing. Fires become judgment. Earthquakes become omens. Each interpretation restores a sense of intelligibility, even when it distorts causation. The Sumerian approach differs subtly. It accepts loss without fully justifying it. Cities fall because eras end. Kingship withdraws, balance resets. There is no insistence that destruction proves guilt. It proves vulnerability. This acceptance does not comfort. It exposes. It leaves humanity exposed to scale, to repetition, to the possibility that effort and virtue are not always sufficient. For many cultures, this exposure is intolerable. Meaning must intervene. As Hebrew tradition develops, meaning takes the form of covenant, a structured relationship between the human and the divine that promises continuity under conditions. Catastrophe, when it occurs, must therefore signal breach. Otherwise, the covenant loses coherence. Sodom and Gomorrah become examples, outliers that reinforce the rule. Their destruction proves that order exists, even if it is harsh. Fire becomes intelligible, framed by narrative necessity. But the price of intelligibility is compression. Complexity is flattened. Environmental specificity dissolves. The region becomes emblematic rather than particular. The catastrophe becomes timeless rather than historical. This flattening has consequences. When later readers encounter the story, they are invited to judge behavior, not to question setting. The land itself fades into background. Its volatility becomes incidental. Modern archaeology disrupts this comfort. It insists on place, on stratigraphy, on material cause. It returns attention to where and how, rather than why in moral terms. In doing so, it reopens questions that narrative had sealed. This reopening is unsettling. It suggests that some disasters attributed to moral failure may have originated in natural processes amplified by location and timing, that cities were not punished so much as positioned poorly. Position is a difficult explanation to accept. It implies that survival may depend less on righteousness than on geography, less on intention than on circumstance. Ancient people may have understood this more clearly than their texts reveal. They avoided certain lands, they respected boundaries, they encoded caution into movement and settlement patterns. These behaviors speak of environmental awareness that does not always surface in story. The biblical narrative preserves a trace of this awareness in the command to flee without delay. There is no attempt to negotiate with the land, no effort to appease it. Survival requires departure, not correction. Once the departure occurs, the story closes the door. The cities are not revisited. Their fate is sealed. Memory moves on, but the land does not. It remains, altered, resistant, quietly recording what occurred. It waits for those willing to listen to stone rather than story. In this sense, geology becomes a rival archive, one that does not moralize, one that does not adapt for transmission. It records pressure, temperature, duration. It tells time differently. When these two archives, textual and material, are placed side by side, tension emerges. Not contradiction, but difference in emphasis. One seeks meaning, the other preserves process. The question then becomes which archive societies trust more and when. For centuries, story held authority. In recent times, material evidence has gained ground. Yet neither archive is complete on its own. Stories preserve human response, fear, interpretation, adaptation. Materials preserve event, force, impact, alteration. Together they approach something closer to experience without ever fully capturing it. As this part of the journey settles, the focus rests on this gap between what happened and what was said to have happened, between land and language, between vulnerability and judgment. In that gap, much of human history resides, shaped by forces that exceed explanation, then reshaped again by the need to live with them. And if meaning often arrives after the fire has passed, then perhaps the most honest question is not why destruction occurred, but how many of our explanations exist primarily to help us continue, rather than to understand. After explanation comes inheritance. Stories do not end when they are told. They settle into those who hear them, shaping expectation long before conscious belief takes hold. A child raised among ruins does not need to be warned about fragility. The ground teaches it daily. A child raised among stories of judgment learns something else, that destruction has reasons, that chaos can be named, that fear can be moralized. In this way, catastrophe gives birth not only to memory, but to worldview. As centuries pass, these worldviews crystallize into identity. A people becomes known by what it believes saved it, or by what it believes destroyed others. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah becomes less about fire and more about distinction. Who belongs inside protection and who remains outside it. Who is spared and who is erased. This distinction offers reassurance. It implies that survival is not arbitrary, that there is a logic to endurance, that if one aligns correctly, the world will respond in kind. Yet reassurance has limits. It works best when disaster is distant, when the sky behaves, when the land yields, when catastrophe remains theoretical, when catastrophe returns, reassurance fractures. In moments of real crisis, people often revert to older instincts that predate explanation. They flee, they cluster, they abandon possessions, they seek elevation. These responses appear across cultures and eras, regardless of belief system. They suggest that beneath story lies something more primal, an inherited memory of what works when structure fails. The biblical account preserves this instinct with unusual clarity. There is no attempt to reform the cities, no effort to understand the fire. There is only urgency. Leave now, do not look back, do not linger. This urgency feels older than theology. It feels procedural, as though the narrative is carrying forward a rule learned the hard way. When certain thresholds are crossed, meaning becomes irrelevant. Motion is the only viable response. Over time, however, urgency becomes symbol. The rule hardens into lesson. Do not look back becomes moral warning rather than survival instruction. The shift is subtle, but significant. It moves the story from the body into the conscience. Once in the conscience, the story can be repurposed. It can be used to enforce conformity, to discourage dissent, to frame difference as danger. Fire from the sky becomes a tool of persuasion. This repurposing is not malicious. It is adaptive. Societies use what they have. Stories that command attention are used to maintain cohesion. But something essential is lost in the process. The memory of scale. The original event, whatever it was, dwarfed human intention. It did not respond to persuasion or correction. It arrived because conditions aligned beyond human control. To reduce it to moral causality is to shrink it, to make it fit inside human systems. Shrinking catastrophe makes it manageable. It also makes it repeatable. When disaster is framed as punishment, people look for transgression. When it is framed as imbalance, they look for patterns. These are very different responses. One seeks blame, the other seeks alignment. The Sumerian worldview leans toward alignment. It accepts that human systems exist within larger rhythms. When those rhythms shift, systems collapse. The collapse is not personal, it is structural. This perspective is less comforting, but more durable. It does not promise safety, it promises awareness. The biblical worldview promises safety through relationship. When catastrophe breaks through, the promise must be defended. Judgment becomes the mechanism. Both approaches offer survival in different ways. One trains attention, the other trains obedience. The tension between them surfaces whenever new evidence emerges. Archaeological findings that suggest sudden destruction challenge moral narratives. They ask uncomfortable questions about fairness, responsibility, and chance. They reintroduce the possibility that some disasters are not messages at all. This possibility threatens identity built on meaning. If catastrophe can occur without reason, then survival becomes uncertain. If survival is uncertain, then belief must adapt again. Adaptation often takes the form of distance. Catastrophe is pushed into the past or projected into the future. It becomes exceptional rather than instructive. The present is declared safe by default. Yet the land does not accept declarations. It responds to pressure, not belief. Salt accumulates. Faults shift. Objects fall from the sky. In this sense, the story of Sodom and Gomorrah remains unresolved because the conditions it gestures toward remain active. The earth has not stabilized. The sky has not become predictable. Civilization continues to operate within uncertainty, even as it pretends otherwise. Perhaps this is why the story refuses to close. It ends not with rebuilding or redemption, but with dispersal, with silence, with a region left behind. Silence is uncomfortable. It invites interpretation. It demands filling. Over centuries, that filling takes many forms: moral, symbolic, speculative. But silence also preserves something essential: space. Space allows memory to breathe without being fixed. It allows fear to exist without becoming doctrine. It allows caution without constant alarm. In the quiet left by vanished cities, imagination continues to work. Scholars dig, theologians argue, scientists measure. Each seeks to claim the story in their own language. None fully succeed. The fire, in this sense, remains unowned. It belongs neither to myth nor to data alone. It sits at the boundary, refusing to be domesticated. As this part of the journey settles, the feeling that emerges is not certainty, but humility. A recognition that some events exceed the frameworks built to contain them. That meaning often follows impact, not the other way around. And if explanation is sometimes a way of coping rather than understanding, then perhaps the most faithful response to ancient catastrophe is not to resolve it, but to remain aware of its implications. Because beneath the stories we inherit, beneath the laws we obey, beneath the landscapes we inhabit, there remains the quiet fact that not everything that ends does so for a reason we can name. And living with that fact may be the oldest lesson of all. When certainty begins to thin, societies do not collapse immediately. Instead, they tighten. They reinforce meanings that feel stable and push uncertainty to the edges of thought. This tightening is subtle. It happens through repetition, through emphasis, through the quiet elevation of certain explanations over others. After catastrophe, authority often speaks more clearly, not less. Commands sharpen, interpretations narrow, ambiguity is treated as weakness. In moments when the world has proven unpredictable, predictability becomes a moral value. Ancient civilizations understood this instinctively. Kingship, priesthood, law, each offered a way to anchor experience when the ground itself had failed. If the sky could burn cities without warning, then meaning had to be secured elsewhere, in hierarchy, in ritual, in obedience. Yet this security was never complete. Beneath the reinforced surface, unease remained. Fire that arrives without negotiation leaves behind a permanent question mark. It raises the possibility that systems exist beyond control, beyond appeal. In Mesopotamian texts, this unease surfaces quietly. The gods grant kingship, then withdraw it. Cities flourish, then disappear. Authority is presented not as absolute, but as borrowed, conditional. The tone is resigned rather than outraged, as though instability were an expected feature of existence. The biblical tradition resists this resignation. It insists on relationship, on dialogue between human and divine. Authority here is not borrowed, it is bestowed with purpose. When catastrophe occurs, it must therefore be explained as rupture in that relationship. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah fits uneasily within this framework. The cities are condemned, but the narrative does not linger on investigation. There is no extended inquiry into cause, no communal reckoning. The event is decisive, final, and quickly sealed. This speed is revealing. It suggests discomfort with the implications of the event. To dwell would be to invite doubt, to question whether judgment fully accounts for what occurred. Silence becomes protective. Afterward, the land is left untouched. No prophet is sent to interpret its ruins. No attempt is made to reclaim its space. The story withdraws, leaving a void. That void functions as a boundary. It marks a place where explanation stops, where narrative refuses to follow. Boundaries like this appear throughout history, events that are acknowledged but not examined, traumas that are commemorated but not discussed. The boundary preserves continuity by limiting inquiry. Civilizations depend on such boundaries. Without them, doubt would spread too freely, structure would weaken, life would become unmanageable. But boundaries also hide information. They prevent learning. They ensure that certain patterns remain unexamined. The physical world does not respect these boundaries. It continues to record what occurred, regardless of whether it is interpreted. Layers accumulate. Minerals transform. Absence persists. Modern methods of inquiry bring these records back into view. They reopen sealed questions. They challenge inherited explanations. They do not replace meaning with certainty. They replace certainty with possibility. This reopening is uncomfortable. It mirrors the original unease that boundaries were built to contain. It suggests that the event remembered as judgment may have been something more indifferent, more impersonal, more difficult to integrate. If fire erased cities because of alignment rather than intention, then survival becomes less about righteousness and more about position, less about obedience and more about awareness. This shift threatens established frameworks. It reduces moral certainty. It introduces vulnerability that cannot be managed through behavior alone. Ancient societies may have sensed this danger. Their reluctance to describe certain catastrophes in detail may reflect not ignorance, but caution. A recognition that too much clarity could destabilize belief. In this sense, ambiguity is not failure, it is design. The Sumerian approach, with its emphasis on cycles and resets, allows ambiguity to exist without crisis. Eras end. New ones begin. The reason is not always known. Acceptance replaces explanation. The biblical approach, oriented toward continuity, struggles more with ambiguity. It needs stories to resolve tension. Judgment serves this role. It restores order by assigning cause. Yet even here, traces of acceptance remain. The destruction is not debated. It is not reinterpreted later. It stands as a closed chapter. Closure, however, does not mean understanding. It means containment. Over generations, containment becomes tradition. The story is told, but its edges are smoothed. Its sharpest implications are dulled. The land fades into background. What survives is the lesson, not the event. But lessons age differently than events. They adapt to new contexts. They shift emphasis. They sometimes reverse meaning. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah has been used to condemn behaviors that bear little resemblance to the ancient context. It has travelled far from its ground. The ground, meanwhile, remains where it is, altered, resistant, quiet. This separation between story and site grows wider with time. Fewer people stand where the cities once stood. Fewer feel the atmosphere. The narrative floats free. When archaeology and geology attempt to reconnect narrative and site, tension returns. The possibility that the story began as memory rather than metaphor re-enters awareness. This possibility does not invalidate belief. It complicates it. It suggests that meaning may have been layered atop experience rather than arising from it. Layering is not deception. It is survival. Humans need stories that allow them to continue living after disaster. Pure memory is often too heavy to carry. The question then becomes not whether the story is true or false, but what function it served at different moments in history. For ancient witnesses, it may have been a way to mark loss without reopening terror. For later generations, a way to teach boundaries. For modern readers, a mirror reflecting unresolved tension between explanation and uncertainty. As this part of the journey settles, attention returns to that tension, to the discomfort that arises when inherited meaning meets material evidence, to the quiet recognition that not all answers are recoverable. Perhaps the persistence of this story is not due to its clarity, but to its refusal to fully explain itself. It leaves space for doubt, for reinterpretation, for unease. And if some events remain beyond the reach of explanation, then the task of memory is not to resolve them, but to hold them carefully, to allow their implications to shape humility rather than certainty. Because beneath every structure built to protect meaning lies the same unsteady ground. And sometimes, the most honest inheritance a civilization can pass down is not an answer, but an awareness of limits. When endurance replaces certainty, a civilization begins to listen differently, not for promises, but for limits. The world is no longer expected to cooperate indefinitely. It is observed, measured in signs, approached with caution earned through loss. This shift does not announce itself. It settles quietly into behavior. Ancient communities that survived abrupt destruction often developed a subdued relationship with the future. Hope remained, but it was tempered. Expansion was no longer assumed to be virtuous. Density was no longer synonymous with strength. What mattered was continuity under constraint. In stories shaped by such experiences, endings are sharp. They do not fade, they arrive. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah exemplifies this sharpness. There is no prologue of decline, no epilogue of repair. One moment the cities exist, the next they do not. The narrative insists on immediacy. This insistence may preserve a memory of thresholds crossed too quickly for adjustment, a point where incremental correction was no longer possible. When conditions align beyond tolerance, systems fail completely. The difficulty of accepting this possibility cannot be overstated. Humans rely on the belief that warning precedes collapse. That error accumulates gradually. That time remains available for response. Sudden endings threaten this belief at its root. Sumerian cosmology accommodates suddenness without protest. Eras end, new ones begin. The reasons are not always known. Knowledge does not guarantee foresight. Wisdom does not guarantee survival. This worldview does not console, it prepares. The biblical worldview seeks consolation through relationship. Covenant promises that behavior matters, that outcomes can be negotiated. When catastrophe intrudes, the promise must be preserved through interpretation. In the Sodom narrative, interpretation is swift, judgment is named, the story moves forward, the land is left behind. Yet the land does not conform to closure. Its barrenness persists, its waters remain hostile, its atmosphere resists habitation. The catastrophe lingers as condition rather than event. This persistence complicates moral framing. If destruction was corrective, why does correction not restore? If judgment was complete, why does the land remain altered? Such questions may explain the narrative's restraint. The text does not dwell on aftermath. It does not revisit the site. It allows the land to remain silent. Silence here is not absence of meaning. It is containment, a recognition that some consequences exceed explanation. Over time, this containment becomes tradition. The story is retold, but its edges soften. The land fades into symbol. The event becomes emblematic rather than particular. Symbols travel easily. They adapt to new contexts. They are useful. But they also detach from the conditions that gave rise to them. Detachment has a cost. When catastrophe is abstracted, its lessons become generic. They warn about behavior rather than environment, about morality rather than alignment. Alignment, however, is where endurance often resides. Alignment with geography, with climate, with thresholds that do not negotiate. Modern systems analysis returns to this insight through different language. It speaks of tipping points, feedback loops, irreversible change. These concepts echo ancient intuitions translated into measurement. Once a threshold is crossed, adjustment is no longer incremental. The system reorganizes itself. Recovery, if it occurs at all, follows a new logic. Ancient people may not have named this process, but they recognized its effects. They moved away from failed sites. They avoided certain lands. They encoded caution into movement and settlement. In the Sodom story, survival depends on relocation, not reform, not resistance. Leaving is the only viable response. This emphasis on departure is often overlooked. It suggests that some dangers cannot be mitigated from within. They require disengagement. Disengagement is difficult. It demands loss of familiarity, of investment, of identity. It asks people to abandon what they have built. The story preserves this difficulty in the figure who looks back. The impulse to witness, to confirm, to hold on to what is disappearing. That impulse is human. It is also hazardous when conditions have irreversibly shifted. The transformation that follows is not moral commentary, it is consequence. Attachment arrests motion. Motion was required. Over generations, this procedural memory becomes moralized. Do not look back becomes a lesson about obedience rather than timing. The context recedes. The instruction remains. Yet beneath the moral layer, the procedural logic persists. When thresholds close, hesitation carries cost. This logic appears in many disaster narratives across cultures. Floods, fires, collapses. Survivors describe moments when explanation ceased to matter. Action mattered. The persistence of this logic suggests that it is not ideological, but experiential. It arises from encounters with scale. Scale overwhelms intention. It renders debate irrelevant. It demands recognition of limits. The land associated with Sodom and Gomorrah continues to enforce this recognition. Attempts to normalize it fail. The environment resists domestication. It reminds visitors, subtly but consistently, that not all spaces are neutral. This reminder operates without story, without argument, without justification. In contrast, human narratives require justification to function. They seek meaning to sustain identity. They cannot live indefinitely within exposure. The tension between land and story is therefore unavoidable. One preserves consequence, the other preserves continuity. When modern inquiry attempts to reconcile these, it often privileges one over the other. Either the story is symbolic or the land is incidental. Such simplification misses the interaction. The story may be symbolic because the land made symbolism necessary. The land may be central because the story could not fully absorb what occurred. Together, they outline an experience that remains incomplete. As civilizations mature, they often assume that incompleteness can be resolved through accumulation of knowledge. More data, better models, improved foresight. These tools matter, they extend awareness, but they do not eliminate thresholds. They do not grant immunity. The ancient posture of restraint may therefore remain relevant, not as resignation, but as orientation. Orientation toward watching rather than assuming, toward movement rather than attachment, toward humility rather than certainty. The endurance of the Sodom story may lie here, not in its moral claims, but in its preservation of exposure. It reminds listeners that systems can fail abruptly, that survival sometimes requires disengagement, that meaning often follows impact. As this part of the journey settles, the atmosphere grows quieter, less concerned with judgment, more attentive to condition. Less focused on blame, more on alignment. If there is wisdom carried forward from cities erased by fire, it may not be a rule to obey, but a posture to inhabit. One that acknowledges limits before they announce themselves. One that values motion when stasis becomes dangerous. One that understands that not every ending arrives with warning, and that endurance often belongs to those who recognize when to let go. And in that recognition, a quieter form of continuity persists. Not guaranteed, not permanent, but attentive enough to survive another cycle. Letting go is rarely described as wisdom. It feels like loss, like failure, like the admission that effort has limits. Yet across long stretches of human memory, survival has often depended on precisely this capacity, the ability to release what no longer aligns with the world as it has become. Civilizations prefer stories of endurance through resistance, walls held, cities rebuilt, order restored. These narratives reassure. They imply that persistence alone guarantees continuity. But beneath these stories runs a quieter record, one less celebrated: survival through withdrawal. After landscapes are altered beyond recovery, those who endure do not always return. They resettle. They adapt to new conditions. They carry fragments of the past forward, but they do not insist on restoring it exactly as it was. The memory of Sodom and Gomorrah preserves this quieter pattern. The cities are not mourned through rebuilding. Their names remain, but their spaces are abandoned. What survives is not architecture, but warning. Not presence, but distance. Distance is an underappreciated form of knowledge. It allows systems to stabilize elsewhere. It prevents repeated exposure to conditions that have proven hostile. It accepts that some places, once changed, cannot be reclaimed without cost exceeding benefit. Ancient cultures often encoded this acceptance through taboo. Certain lands were avoided, certain waters left untouched. These prohibitions were not always explained. They did not need to be. The absence of explanation preserved compliance more effectively than debate. Over time, as direct memory faded, taboo transformed into symbolism. Avoided places became cursed. Distance became moral separation. What began as environmental adaptation hardened into narrative boundary. This hardening created clarity, but it also obscured origin. The land was avoided not because it was unstable, but because it was judged. The danger was relocated from condition to character. Relocation of danger is comforting. It implies that safety can be secured through behavior alone. That catastrophe belongs to the disobedient, not the misaligned. Yet this comfort is fragile. It collapses when conditions change without regard for virtue. In such moments, the older logic reasserts itself. People flee, they abandon structures, they seek new ground, meaning follows later. The biblical account of escape from Sodom retains this logic with striking purity. The urgency is absolute. There is no preparation, no ritual, no attempt to preserve artifacts. Survival demands speed. Speed here is not recklessness, it is recognition. Recognition that conditions have crossed a threshold where deliberation no longer serves. This recognition is not intellectual, it is bodily. The same instinct that compels movement during earthquake or fire. Thought lags, action leads. Stories that preserve this instinct often appear abrupt, even cruel. They offer no consolation. They do not allow reflection. But their harshness may reflect fidelity to experience rather than indifference to suffering. Experience teaches that when environments reorganize suddenly, attachment becomes hazardous. The longer one remains, the narrower the options become. The image of looking back captures this danger precisely. It is not curiosity that condemns, but delay. The moment spent turning is the moment lost. Over centuries, this image becomes moralized. Obedience replaces timing. But the underlying principle remains. Survival depends on recognizing when the past can no longer be recovered. Recognition of irreversibility is one of the hardest lessons humans face. It contradicts hope. It resists narratives of redemption. It insists that some losses are permanent. Yet permanence does not equal meaninglessness. What is lost may still shape what follows. In Sumerian tradition, the end of an era does not erase its influence. Knowledge survives in fragments. Practices adapt. Memory disperses. This dispersal allows continuity without restoration. It avoids fixation on place. It emphasizes movement of people rather than preservation of structures. The biblical tradition, despite its focus on covenant and land, reflects a similar outcome here. After Sodom, the narrative shifts away. Attention moves elsewhere. The land remains absent. Absence becomes instructive. It marks a boundary that should not be crossed again. Not because crossing is sinful, but because conditions no longer permit life as it was. This kind of instruction does not announce itself as wisdom. It operates quietly, shaping settlement patterns, trade routes, habitation density. Over generations, people may forget why certain choices feel obvious. They simply know not to linger, not to build there, not to rely on that ground. Such knowing does not require explanation. It requires trust in inherited caution. Modern societies often struggle with this form of trust. They prefer explicit reasoning, quantified risk, documented cause. Yet even with data, thresholds remain elusive. Some shifts cannot be reversed once initiated. Some environments degrade beyond recovery. In these cases, insistence on restoration becomes a liability. Resources are wasted, exposure increases, loss compounds. Ancient stories that valorize withdrawal may therefore hold relevance beyond their symbolic uses. They offer a counter-narrative to persistence at all costs. Persistence has value, but only within tolerances. Beyond those tolerances, adaptability matters more. The endurance of the Sodom story may lie in this tension. It does not celebrate endurance. It records escape. It preserves the uncomfortable truth that survival sometimes requires abandonment. This truth conflicts with ideals of mastery. It undermines narratives of control. It suggests that alignment, not dominance, governs longevity. Alignment requires attentiveness. It demands sensitivity to change. It accepts that the world does not owe continuity to human systems. Ancient cultures, living closer to environmental volatility, may have internalized this acceptance more readily. Their stories reflect not optimism or despair, but pragmatism shaped by exposure. Over time, as buffers increased and technologies expanded, this pragmatism faded. Confidence grew. Distance from consequence widened. Stories like this remain as reminders of vulnerability. They interrupt certainty. They resist closure. As this part of the journey settles, the emphasis shifts from what was destroyed to what was carried forward. Not stone, not wealth, not identity bound to place, but awareness. Awareness that some environments do not forgive repeated alignment errors. Awareness that timing matters as much as intention. Awareness that letting go can be an act of survival rather than surrender. If there is a continuity preserved beneath centuries of retelling, it may be this awareness. Quiet, unspectacular, but resilient. And if civilizations endure not by clinging to every inheritance, but by discerning which inheritances to release, then the memory of cities erased by fire may still be performing its work, not by warning against sin, but by reminding listeners that survival often begins with movement, and that sometimes the most faithful response to irreversible change is not to rebuild what was lost, but to carry forward what still can live. Movement once chosen reshapes memory in unexpected ways. When people leave a place behind, especially under pressure, their recollection of it becomes selective. Details blur, emotions condense. What remains is not a map but an impression, a sense of what must not be repeated. In the generations after abandonment, stories shift from geography to identity. The question is no longer where something happened, but who survived it. Survival becomes proof of alignment, not with morality alone, but with timing. Those who moved at the right moment live on to tell the story. Those who did not are absorbed into silence. This asymmetry quietly alters narrative authority. The story belongs to the survivors. It is shaped by their perspective, their relief, their need to justify departure. What was left behind cannot speak for itself. In the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, this imbalance is absolute. No voice emerges from the cities. No counter-memory persists. The land is silent. The story moves on without resistance. Silence is powerful. It allows interpretation to solidify. Without competing accounts, meaning hardens quickly. The absence of survivors from the cities enables the moral framing to dominate. The narrative becomes unchallenged terrain. Yet silence also invites projection. Over time, the cities become whatever later generations need them to be. Symbols of excess, warnings against deviation, evidence for arguments unrelated to the original context. This malleability is not accidental. It is the result of a story severed from its environment. When place is removed, narrative becomes portable. Portable narratives are useful, but they lose specificity. Specificity, however, is where caution lives. It reminds listeners that catastrophe occurred under particular conditions, not as a general rule. When specificity fades, caution becomes abstract. The survivors' movement away from the destroyed cities may have preserved life, but it also initiated this abstraction. Distance protects the body, but it transforms memory. In Sumerian tradition, this transformation is acknowledged. Survivors disperse, knowledge fragments. No single narrative claims total authority. Memory remains plural, unstable, reflective of disruption. The biblical tradition, seeking coherence, consolidates memory. It chooses clarity over plurality. One explanation prevails. This consolidation offers strength. It binds community. It provides orientation, but it also narrows interpretation. It limits the range of lessons that can be drawn. The narrowing becomes evident in how the story is later used. It is invoked to regulate behavior rather than to examine vulnerability, to enforce norms rather than to question alignment with environment. This use is understandable. Societies require cohesion. Stories that support cohesion are favoured, yet cohesion built on abstraction can become brittle. When new disruptions arise that do not fit the inherited moral framework, confusion follows. The story no longer prepares, it reassures falsely. In such moments, the older logic of movement reasserts itself. People evacuate, they relocate, they abandon norms temporarily in favour of survival. The body remembers what the story has softened. This pattern suggests that beneath moral interpretation lies a procedural memory that persists across eras, a memory of thresholds crossed and the necessity of leaving. Procedural memory does not argue, it activates. In modern disasters, this activation is visible. Alarms ignored until the last moment, then sudden urgency, flight, displacement. Afterward, explanation and blame. The sequence mirrors the ancient narrative. Warning, delay, sudden movement, silence. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah may endure because it preserves this sequence in compressed form. It does not linger on preparation or recovery. It focuses on the pivot point, the moment when staying becomes impossible. That pivot point is rarely recognized in advance. It is felt, a shift in atmosphere, a sense that conditions have changed irreversibly. Ancient people, attuned to environment, may have recognized such shifts more readily. Their survival depended on it. Their stories reflect not foresight, but responsiveness. As societies grow more buffered, responsiveness dulls, systems intervene, time expands, confidence grows. Stories then serve as proxies for lost attentiveness. They remind listeners of vulnerability, even as daily life denies it. But reminders fade when they are overused or misapplied. When the story becomes a slogan, its original force diminishes. The land, however, does not become a slogan. It continues to enforce its conditions. The Dead Sea Basin remains resistant. Attempts to normalize it falter. This resistance suggests that some memories are better preserved materially than narratively. The land remembers without reinterpretation. Yet humans cannot live within material memory alone. They require story to orient action. The challenge, then, is balance. To allow story to guide without obscuring condition. To retain specificity without paralysis. The Sumerian plurality of memory may have offered this balance. Multiple accounts, incomplete explanations, acceptance of uncertainty. The biblical consolidation sacrifices plurality for coherence. It gains strength, but loses flexibility. Both approaches carry risk. Too much plurality dissolves meaning. Too much coherence blinds awareness. Perhaps the endurance of the Sodom story lies in this unresolved tension. It oscillates between specificity and abstraction, between environment and morality, between movement and judgment. As this part of the journey settles, attention returns to the act of leaving itself, not as escape, but as recognition. Recognition that some alignments cannot be corrected from within. Leaving does not erase loss. It carries loss forward in altered form. Memory travels with survivors, reshaped by distance. What they carry is not the city, but the moment it ceased to be viable. This moment becomes a reference point, even when its details fade. It shapes risk perception. It influences future decisions. Over centuries, this influence may be invisible, but it persists. Civilizations inherit not only structures and beliefs, but instincts forged under pressure. These instincts surface when conditions align again. In this way, the destruction of cities long vanished may still be exerting force. Not through doctrine, but through readiness to move. And if survival sometimes depends less on understanding why something ends than on recognizing when it has ended, then the deepest lesson carried forward may be this: that continuity is not always preserved by holding on. Sometimes it is preserved by knowing when to step away, before silence becomes permanent. When silence becomes permanent, it changes the scale of memory. What was once an event settles into background, shaping assumptions rather than stories. People grow up knowing that certain outcomes are possible, even if they cannot name when or why. This knowledge does not announce itself. It hums beneath confidence. By the time a civilization reaches this stage, catastrophe is no longer remembered as fire or flight. It is remembered as boundary, as an invisible line that must not be crossed, even if its location shifts with time. The legacy of Sodom and Gomorrah may reside here, not in the flames themselves, but in the enduring intuition that some systems fail all at once, that there are points beyond which recovery is not a matter of effort, but of circumstance. This intuition does not forbid ambition, it shadows it. Ambition returns quickly after loss. Humans rebuild. They always do. New cities rise. Trade resumes. Confidence grows. The memory of erasure dims enough to allow investment again. This is not denial, it is necessity. Yet the rebuilt world is never identical to the one that vanished. It carries adjustments made quietly, almost unconsciously. Choices of location, scale, distance, the kinds of risks considered acceptable. In the ancient Near East, these adjustments appear in settlement patterns that fluctuate between concentration and dispersion. Periods of dense urban life alternate with phases of fragmentation. Neither is permanent. Each responds to pressures felt rather than fully understood. The destruction associated with Sodom and Gomorrah may mark one of these inflection points, a moment when concentration proved vulnerable and dispersion offered survival. The memory of this shift would persist long after its cause faded. Such persistence does not require narrative reinforcement. It operates through practice, through decisions that feel prudent without recalling why, through preferences inherited rather than taught. Over generations, these preferences become culture. Culture in turn becomes identity. People come to believe they value moderation, humility, or obedience, without recognizing that these values may have been shaped by exposure to limits rather than abstract ideals. In this way, catastrophe becomes a silent architect. It designs behavior without drafting blueprints. It shapes norms without issuing decrees. The biblical tradition preserves a visible trace of this architecture. The emphasis on hospitality, restraint, and attentiveness to warning may reflect not only moral aspiration, but inherited caution, a sensitivity to thresholds that once closed abruptly. At the same time, the tradition reframes this caution in ethical terms. Behavior becomes the focus. Alignment with environment recedes into the background. This reframing allows the story to travel across contexts. It becomes adaptable, teachable, enforceable, but it also distances the lesson from the conditions that produced it. Distance can be dangerous. It creates the illusion that catastrophe belongs only to those who transgress rules, not to those who misjudge systems. It suggests that safety is guaranteed by correctness rather than awareness. History repeatedly challenges this illusion. Cities fall despite order. Societies collapse despite intention. Systems fail not because of immorality, but because of accumulated stress reaching a breaking point. When this happens, the older intuition re-emerges. People speak of being caught off guard, of things changing faster than expected, of realizing too late that the ground had shifted. These expressions echo ancient experiences even when the context is modern. They reveal continuity beneath difference. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah may endure because it preserves this continuity. It compresses the experience of sudden reversal into a form that can be recalled when needed, even if its original meaning has been layered over. Its power lies not in explanation, but in recognition. Recognition that stability can vanish quickly. That warning does not always arrive early. That survival sometimes depends on movement rather than correction. As societies advance technologically, this recognition becomes harder to maintain. Systems grow complex. Buffers increase. Feedback is delayed. Confidence expands. Stories then serve as counterweights. They interrupt assumptions of immunity. They whisper of fragility in cultures built on control. But whispers can be ignored. They can be recited without being heard. The land, however, continues to speak through condition, through scarcity, through resistance, through sudden change. The Dead Sea Basin remains one such voice. It does not offer narrative. It offers constraint. It enforces memory through persistence rather than persuasion. In this persistence lies a challenge to all inherited interpretations, moral, symbolic, or speculative. The land asks not to be believed, but to be reckoned with. Modern societies often struggle with this form of reckoning. They prefer to fix rather than adapt, to restore rather than withdraw, to assert continuity where discontinuity has already occurred. This struggle reflects a deeper discomfort with limits. Limits undermine mastery. They force acknowledgement of dependence on systems beyond control. Ancient cultures, living closer to volatility, may have integrated limits more fully into their worldview. Their stories do not promise safety. They offer orientation. Orientation is subtle. It does not prevent catastrophe. It shapes response. The orientation preserved in the Sodom story is not one of despair, but of readiness. A readiness to move when conditions no longer support life as it is known. A readiness to accept loss without insisting on restoration. This readiness does not erase grief. It carries grief forward without letting it immobilize. In later retellings, this readiness becomes obscured by judgment. The focus shifts to fault, to deserving, to outcome as verdict. Yet beneath the verdict, the readiness remains encoded. It surfaces when systems strain, when environments change, when thresholds approach. In these moments, people rediscover the old logic without naming it. They evacuate, they relocate, they abandon what cannot be saved. Afterward, explanations multiply. Blame is assigned. Meaning is constructed. But survival has already occurred, guided by something older than explanation. As this part of the journey nears its close, attention turns toward that guiding undercurrent. the quiet intelligence that operates beneath belief, the memory that does not speak but acts. If civilizations inherit anything durable from ancient catastrophe, it may be this undercurrent, not a doctrine, but a disposition toward attentiveness rather than certainty, toward movement rather than fixation, toward humility in the face of systems larger than intention. The cities erased by fire may no longer exist, but the conditions that erased them have not disappeared from the world. They have only changed form. In this sense, the story remains unfinished, not because it lacks an ending, but because its implications continue to unfold. And if history is less a sequence of lessons learned than a rhythm of forgetting and remembering, then the value of such stories may lie in their ability to restore awareness just before it is needed. Awareness that some endings arrive without negotiation. Awareness that alignment matters more than argument. Awareness that survival, when it comes, often belongs to those who recognize when staying has become the greater risk. And in that awareness, a quieter continuity persists, one not guaranteed by strength or virtue, but sustained by the willingness to move with the world as it changes rather than insisting it remain as it was. At the end of every long memory lies a question that cannot be answered directly. It does not ask for facts or names or dates. It asks something quieter. What remains after certainty dissolves? When the fire has passed, when cities have vanished, when explanations have hardened and then thinned again with time, what persists is not a conclusion, but a posture, a way of standing in the world shaped by awareness rather than assurance. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah does not conclude with restoration. It does not offer redemption through rebuilding. It ends with dispersal, with silence, with a land left behind. This ending is unusual and perhaps deliberate. It resists the human preference for closure. Closure suggests mastery. It implies that an event has been absorbed, understood, resolved. But some events refuse this treatment. They remain incomplete, not because information is missing, but because their implications cannot be contained within a single frame. Ancient cultures may have understood this intuitively. Their stories often end not with answers, but with thresholds, with boundaries drawn where inquiry must stop, not out of ignorance, but out of respect for scale. The fire that erased cities in the memory of the ancient world did more than destroy structures. It exposed a limit of planning, of morality, of foresight. It revealed that human systems operate within larger dynamics that do not explain themselves. This revelation is unsettling. It undermines confidence in progress as a safeguard. It questions the assumption that knowledge always arrives in time. It suggests that survival sometimes depends less on understanding and more on responsiveness. Responsiveness does not require certainty. It requires attentiveness. Throughout this journey, attentiveness has appeared again and again as a quiet inheritance, in movement rather than doctrine, in avoidance rather than conquest, in stories that warn without explaining fully. The Sumerian records, fragmentary and restrained, preserve this attentiveness by refusing to moralize catastrophe completely. The biblical narrative preserves it by encoding urgency and departure, even as it frames meaning more tightly. Neither tradition offers comfort in the modern sense. Neither promises immunity. Both gesture toward exposure. Exposure is difficult to live with. It invites anxiety. It resists control. And so, across centuries, layers of interpretation have been added to soften it. Moral frameworks, symbolic uses, doctrinal certainty. These layers are understandable. They help societies function. They allow daily life to proceed without constant awareness of fragility. Yet fragility does not disappear when it's unacknowledged. It simply waits. The land associated with Sodom and Gomorrah continues to bear witness to this waiting. Not dramatically, but persistently, through barrenness, through chemical imbalance, through resistance to habitation. The land does not accuse. It does not explain. It simply remains altered. In this, it mirrors the deepest layer of the story itself. Beneath judgment, beneath symbolism, beneath debate, there is alteration. A before and an after that do not reconnect. Perhaps this is why the story endures across cultures and eras, not because it answers questions, but because it preserves the memory of disconnection. Disconnection from place, from certainty, from the assumption that continuity is guaranteed. In modern times, this memory feels increasingly relevant. Systems once assumed stable reveal stress. Climate shifts accelerate. Feedback loops tighten. Thresholds approach quietly, without announcement. Once again, societies search for explanation, for blame, for reassurance, and once again, there is a risk of mistaking explanation for protection. The ancient posture of restraint offers an alternative, not resignation, but awareness, not despair, but realism. Restraint does not mean refusing to build. It means building with the understanding that structures are provisional, that location matters, that timing matters, that alignment matters. It means recognizing when persistence becomes exposure. The story's final silence may be its most important feature. Silence leaves room for reflection without dictating outcome. It invites listening rather than belief. In silence, attention shifts outward, to land, to sky, to pattern, and inward, to instinct, to unease, to the subtle signals that something is changing. These signals are easy to ignore when life feels stable. They are harder to ignore when stability fractures. The inheritance carried forward from ancient catastrophe may not be a warning about sin or virtue, but an invitation to notice thresholds before they close, to notice when systems strain rather than assume they will recover, to notice when staying requires more faith than leaving. This noticing does not guarantee survival. Nothing does, but it shapes response. Response in the end is all that remains when certainty dissolves. The story does not tell us how to prevent fire from falling. It tells us what survival looked like when it did. Movement, release, silence. These are not heroic qualities. They do not inspire monuments. They do not flatter identity. Yet they have carried life forward more than once. If there is a final lesson embedded in the long echo of Sodom and Gomorrah, it may be this: that civilization endures not by denying vulnerability, but by remembering it without becoming paralyzed, by holding stories lightly enough to adapt, but seriously enough to listen, by understanding that some knowledge is not meant to be spoken loudly, but to be felt as orientation, and by accepting that not every ending offers meaning, but every ending reshapes the terrain on which meaning will be sought next. As the journey comes to rest here, there is no conclusion to draw, no verdict to deliver, only a quiet awareness that history is not a straight path, but a series of thresholds. Some are crossed slowly, others in an instant. What matters is not whether thresholds exist, but whether they are noticed before silence becomes the only response left. And in that awareness, fragile and unfinished, the memory continues, not as fire, not as city, not as judgment, but as a question carried forward, asking each generation how closely it is listening to the ground beneath its feet.